Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Trail Mix, where the nuts might be a little stale, but the company is always fresh.
And here we are with, I gotta say, my cousin, Carolyn. But you're here in another capacity because you used to be a federal prosecutor, so you understand these things. And we're talking about this fella, Alexander Acosta.
Yes.
Or do we just say Alex?
I think he did go by that.
And it's important because this is a prosecutor who let Jeff Epstein off the hook early on in this stuff and wound up on Trump's cabinet. And we're going to be talking about how all that happened. Tell us who you are and what you come from.
Yeah, well, Carolyn, and I was a federal prosecutor for a bit over 30 years. I practiced in 4 different jurisdictions, mostly U.S. attorneys' offices. There are 94 U.S. attorneys' offices in the United States. I practiced in 4. I also did some work at what we call Main Justice, which is DOJ in D.C. So a variety of experience, almost all criminal.
So I think we've proved the credibility of our witness. That's why you're here, to keep me honest.
Yeah.
as can be done. But first, let's start with a clip from President Trump, 2019, on the day that this prosecutor and then his Secretary of Labor actually resigned from his cabinet over the controversy about how he had handled the Epstein case.
He's a great labor secretary, not a good labor secretary. He's done a fantastic job. He's a friend of everybody in the administration. And I got a call this morning early from Alex, and I think he did a very good job yesterday. Under a lot of pressure, he did a fantastic job, and he explained it. And he made a deal that people were happy with, and then 12 years later, they're not happy with it. You'll have to figure all of that out. But the fact is, he has been a fantastic Secretary of Labor. And Alex called me this morning, and he wanted to see me. And I actually said, well, we have the press right out here, so perhaps you just want to say it to the press.
So now let's talk about the deal that Trump's referring to, where he says it was a good deal, and then 12 years later, people thought it was a bad deal. What is the deal we're talking about here?
That was the agreement between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Palm Beach state attorney that the federal government would not prosecute. There was actually a signed NPA, non-prosecution agreement, but that Epstein would plead guilty to the state charges, and that he would agree and would recommend that there be I believe it was a 2-year term of imprisonment. That was later lowered to 18 months for some reason, but that he would agree to that. There was also a part in there that there would be a fund set up for victims, and that they would be able to seek recompense from Epstein for any damages. That was part of the NPA, I believe. So that was the agreement, and it did actually go through. He did plead guilty to the state charges.
It was unusual that the federal government was making a deal with somebody to plead to state charges, but that was a way of the federal government just staying out of it, or?
It is not unusual for the federal government and the state government to have concurrent jurisdiction over certain crimes. That happens frequently. And very often the U.S. Attorney's Office and the state attorney or district attorney's office will agree who will lead, who will handle the case. So, that does happen fairly often. Where there is actually a signed non-prosecution agreement is more unusual. And I don't know why they decided to do it that way, but I would say that is a bit more unusual.
So to just bright line this, what we have is this Alex Acosta was a U.S. attorney at the time, right? He was the U.S. attorney
of Southern District of Florida, specifically
in Miami.
Correct.
And at that time, he, or his office at least, made a decision ultimately to do what with Epstein federally?
That they would not prosecute. They would not prosecute. And in fact, in the report by the Office of Professional Responsibility, which is a part of DOJ, Acosta, during that investigation, did take responsibility for that decision, for making the ultimate decision that the U.S. Attorney's Office would not prosecute Epstein.
Now, on that point, I went back to 2019 when this all came out, and it turned out he was sitting on Trump's cabinet, this guy. We all learned that this prosecutor who had made that deal with Epstein had ended up on Trump's cabinet, and then it came out and he wound up resigning over it. But at first, when he was trying to save his job on Trump's cabinet, he threw the state under the bus. And here's 10 seconds of him talking about the state.
Simply put, the Palm Beach State Attorney's Office was ready to let Epstein walk free. No jail time, nothing.
So what? Isn't that what he did?
Well, with the understanding that the state would charge something, but as to whether the state was willing to let him walk free, there is no evidence of that. Yeah, that's not really contained in the report. The ultimate plea agreement with Palm Beach did say that he would agree to a term of 2 years incarceration. So I can't say what the state attorney's office might have been prepared to do earlier than that. I think was certainly rather cavalier of Acosta to suggest that when there is no proof one way or the other of that.
Because then he goes into, in this same press conference and answering questions, why they decided not to prosecute and make this deal with Epstein. And he explains some sort of general principles of prosecution decisions in this, and we'll play a little of that.
There is a big gulf between sufficient evidence to go to trial and sufficient evidence to be confident in the outcome of that trial. And I know that in 2019, looking back on 2008, things may look different, but this was the judgment of prosecutors with dozens of years of experience.
And Acosta was as we said, the prosecutor who agreed to what many say is a lenient plea deal made with Jeffrey Epstein. We've got Stephanie Gosk here, who's been covering this case. He keeps talking about rolling the dice, suggesting there was no evidence to go forward with the trial. What do we know about what they knew about Epstein at the time?
Well, this is actually really important, Lester, and this gets confusing, all these little details, but here's the real takeaway. First, people have to remember that Jeffrey Epstein has been charged with sex trafficking and conspiracy to traffic minors here in New York. And when you look back, and we've got the 2008 plea agreement here, you look at the fact that they were actually looking at those exact same charges back then.
And the thing is, he's also throwing his own prosecutors under the bus in a sense here, isn't he? Because he's saying, well, they decided they didn't have enough to prosecute. And the interesting thing about this is the facts they had in front of them in those days were the same facts that ultimately the New York prosecutors 12 years later used to charge Epstein.
Well, in New York, they would have also had more charges because they would have the offenses that Epstein had committed in New York. So they probably had a lot more evidence. I don't know that for a fact, but they probably did, because they would have had the addition of the offense is committed in New York. But as to whether your suggestion that Acosta was throwing his own prosecutors under the bus, I would agree to that, because yet in the OPR report, which came out in 2020, Acosta admits that he made the decision to not prosecute federally. He took full responsibility for that. And as the U.S. attorney, he certainly had that right to do so. But he takes responsibility for it in the report.
And so why are we talking about this? Epstein's back in the news now, obviously. And Trump's relationship with Epstein is at issue. And we go back in time to his first term as president, and he put on his cabinet a prosecutor, this Acosta we're talking about, who had given Epstein a sweetheart deal. Now, you would think that alone would be a reason to stay away from putting Acosta on his cabinet. It almost seems like payback.
Well, all of the information about that case was not available at that time. It was the Miami Herald that actually gets the credit for bringing this to light when they wrote a report in 2018. That was, it came out November 28th of 2018. And it was very compelling reading how that case had been handled. And I think that Acosta was appointed and confirmed in April of 2017. It wasn't until the report by Miami Herald that it was so widely known what had happened.
Trump knew.
You would think that there had been some vetting of Acosta before he was. And I do believe that at Acosta's confirmation hearing in 2017, he was asked about it when he had his confirmation hearing, but only in passing. There was not a lot of conversation about it, but he was questioned about it.
So to wrap up, we're basically looking at something that can be argued was a gift to Epstein by this prosecutor and a reward to him from the president, who was Epstein's best friend, some say.
I guess that would be one way to view it. I can't say that because I don't know that. I don't know what the motivations were. And I look at it as a prosecutor. Was there sufficient evidence to prosecute it federally? And was this the best decision? Now, the OPR decision does say that they
That's
say
the Office of Professional Regulation.
Professional responsibility. Yes, which is a part of the Department of Justice, and they investigate allegations of professional misconduct on the part of lawyers who work for the Department of Justice. And even though Acosta was gone at the time that they did this investigation, they also have jurisdiction over former employees. And they did find that Acosta exercised poor judgment in how he handled the case, that his view of federalism and was misguided, and that he exercised poor judgment. They did not find misconduct, professional misconduct, but they did say that he exercised poor judgment.
And at the end of the day, we've got a president now who's still under siege for his relationship, whatever it was, with Epstein. And it's sort of been forgotten that back when he was in his first term, there was this prosecutor who had given Epstein a sweetheart deal that Trump hired.
As I say, I look at it from the prosecutor's viewpoint, and whether or not there was, appropriate handling of a manner. So that's my viewpoint, Craig.
And that's what we're looking for. And when you were prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, did you have, I can't even imagine similar cases to this or anything remotely close to this? What I'm getting at is the evidence in this case, the testimony that they had. Would you have thought it would be sufficient based on what you've looked at?
I can't answer that because I haven't seen what evidence they had. I don't know, but I would guess that there were grand jury proceedings in Miami. They investigated the case for almost a year. So I would guess that there were some grand jury sessions dealing with the case, and they would have had other evidence too. So, and I haven't had the opportunity to review that. But the OPR report does say that they disagreed with Acosta's view of federalism. They certainly didn't have the opportunity to review the evidence either, so they did not say we think you should have prosecuted, just that your viewpoint was flawed, your judgment was flawed. And I would say too that there, between the time of the 09 when they were 07, 06 when they were first looking at the case in 2020, I would say that the view of federalism in child endangerment cases had expanded somewhat.
Now, when you talk about federalism, you're talking about whether the federal government has a role in these type of cases.
Exactly, yes, and whether the cases should be brought in federal court. And traditionally, child abuse cases have been state cases, not federal cases. And if it's just a child abuse, it would be state. Where it's child sexual abuse or taking children across state lines, as was alleged by that Epstein did, then it becomes a federal offense. And the laws have changed so that the laws are more expansive regarding federal jurisdiction. And I think that the Department of Justice has taken a bigger role in that in the last couple of decades. But still, even in 2007, when the prosecutor who was actually in charge of the case in Miami submitted a draft indictment of Epstein. That was in May of 2007. I think proposing 60 counts. And so the AUSA had put a good bit of work into it and I would guess believed in the case. But so I'm sure there had been some grand jury testimony in Miami at that time. But I haven't seen it, so I can't say. I think it was probably definitely a viable case. And Acosta says that sufficient evidence to go to trial and sufficient to get a guilty verdict is that he does make a good point there. But I would suggest that the Department of Justice standards suggest that you should not take a case and have a case indicted and take it to trial unless you believe there's a reasonable chance of a conviction. It would seem to me, with the evidence that they had, that they did have, that there was a reasonable chance that he would have been convicted.
And there's support for that in that the New York federal prosecutors did decide there was enough evidence.
Grand jury decided there was enough evidence, but also they had additional evidence because they would have had the crimes that were also committed in New York, not just in Florida. And they would have had anything, could have exercised jurisdiction over the ones too, or that might have occurred in the Virgin Islands because many of those victims were transported. So there would have been further charges than what might have been available in Southern District of Florida.
And lastly, there were two things about that case of Acosta's, Alex Acosta, who was U.S. attorney, who decided on this deal with Epstein. One was they made it secret, the deal that they made with Epstein.
That is correct. Yes.
And as I understand it, even the witnesses didn't know.
Even the victims, correct. Yes, it was filed under seal. It was filed under seal.
So even the victims weren't told about the arrangement that they had made with Epstein, which basically let him off the hook.
Not initially. And that was part of the investigation by OPR, because there is a federal law, the Crime Victims' Rights Act, that says that you have to keep the victims informed of what's going on. But the courts of appeal have said that only comes into play once a person has been charged federally. And Epstein had not been charged federally, nor was he ever. So there was no violation of that federal law. But still, that OPR said in their report that there was poor judgment also on the part of Acosta in keeping the victims better informed. They didn't necessarily violate that law, but they should have been more forthcoming with the victims.
And the other thing that was so remarkable is that Epstein didn't really get much punishment from this. I mean, despite all the claims that they'd made a deal for him to be incarcerated, that was a big joke.
Well, he served maybe a year but in the local jail. He didn't even have to go to state prison. He was
and they let him go to the office.
He went to work. He had organized some company, and he went to work at whatever that company was, went out every day, and then came back at night and spent the night at the jail. Not hard time.
So I mean, basically they gave him time to commit more crimes.
Perhaps.
That's why we have you here, Carolyn. You let me make the unsupported statements and pull me back from the brink.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking some more about legal stuff so that you can keep me honest.
Okay. Be glad to do what I can.
Okay, I'm Lady Mau Mau, Craig's built-in emergency brake. If this wasn't enough for you, sign up for the newsletter. It's free, it's thoughtful, and it occasionally makes sense.